But let's go into all the details of what's been a momentous weekend, not just obviously for the Middle East, but for the wider world. And also, interestingly, today, up in the Northern Territory, Australia's involved in US joint exercises, Talisman Sabre it's called. There was supposed to be a press conference, but it was abruptly cancelled, picked up, of course, by our Bureau Chief up there, Matt Cunningham. And then, of course, we had the Prime Minister's press conference and a whole lot of blocking, as we've talked about, not a lot of answers. Someone who has some answers for us, the Director of Strategic Analysis Australia, Michael Shoebridge, who joins me now. I want to get into the nuts and bolts of Operation Midnight Hammer because I find it absolutely fascinating, Michael. But just for a moment, let's talk about the Prime Minister's response today, that press conference. And as I said, those blocking lines of just unilateral action by the United States and absolutely no detail. He called it over as quick as he could and just scarpered out of the room.
Yes, Peter, he really was like some Monty Python parrot sketch where he was just parroting what Penny Wong had said earlier in the day and he had nothing else left. But while he was desperate not to say anything about national security and told us he couldn't, what a contrast with how much we heard from the Americans about a far more sensitive operational activity. And he spoke about Pine Gap like it wasn't a joint facility and he barely knew what might be going on there. So unfortunately, even after that National Security Committee meeting, he was completely out of his depth.
Yeah, I thought exactly the same thing. It is a joint facility, PM, not just a US asset in our own country. So talk to me about sort of the operational detail of Midnight Hammer, because clearly, and I mentioned this at the top of the show, those lines about that 2-week grace that Donald Trump put on the table made me feel very despondent on the weekend. I thought, here we go again. They'll get close to wiping out Iran's nuclear capability, but they won't finish it off. But here he was on Sunday, and they went public with, 7 B-2 bombers, 125 warplanes, precision weaponry. They were in and they were out before the world woke up. Extraordinary. I think I've got a bit of a grab there to play. Let's listen.
We devastated the Iranian nuclear program. The operation did not target Iranian troops or the Iranian people. Tehran is certainly calculating the reality that planes flew from the middle of America and Missouri overnight, completely undetected over 3 of their most highly sensitive sites.
And of course, remember, they put out some messaging to say that there were bombers going through Guam. So we all looked towards Guam, but of course they were coming around the other way as well and into this strike. I mean, you tell me what you thought of it all, but I think it's extraordinary.
Well, Peter, it was an elaborately, very successfully orchestrated global mission. You're right, there was the deception effort to have everyone watching B-2 bombers pre-position in Guam. Meanwhile, the bombers that did the attack, as we heard from Pete Hegseth, flew directly from continental America to the Middle East. They had to meet up with air-to-air refuelers that came out of parts of Europe. Shorter range fighters, things like F-15s and F-35s, flew into Iranian airspace. The fighters were in front, suppressing any remaining Iranian air defence. The Iranians didn't see them coming in. The B-2 pilots would have rehearsed the kind of facility, the exact facility and its design and layout that they bombed. They bombed with multiple of those massive penetrator bombs. 7 aircraft let 14 of them loose over those sites. And then they left, and the Iranians didn't even know they'd turned up, but were coping with the damage.
So extraordinary sophistication here. How will we know? I mean, we know it was a success in that they came in, they bombed and they got out alive, but how do we know how much we have set back their nuclear ambitions? When will we know that?
Well, we know something now because there's been early satellite imagery of the damage to the 3 sites, Esfahan, Natanz, and that one buried so deep under the mountain at Fordo. It looks like there's extensive structural damage to all 3. That means that a lot of the technical equipment and facilities Iran needs to enrich uranium and then manufacture it into the kind of uranium metal you stick on the top of a warhead has been lost. But it's quite likely that the Iranians dispersed some of their around 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium before the strikes.
So that could be moved somewhere in country, you presume, or potentially buried in other bunkers?
I'd say they would disperse that because they're feeling extremely vulnerable. They know Israel's Mossad intelligence agency has penetrated the Iranian regime comprehensively. They know that they've lost control of their airspace that's under Israeli control. So there are very few places they can hide now. But this is small amounts of stuff.
Okay, so we know that they're militias under pressure, the Houthis and others. We know Hezbollah, which was one of their agents over in Lebanon and into Syria, of course, is monumentally degraded. So they're down to what they've got in their own country. There's been hits to their scientists. There's been hits to their guard leadership and their intelligence leadership. We know the Ayatollah is in hiding. What happens now? Because Trump, in the last few hours, has sort of amped up the discussion of regime change. That wasn't there yesterday. It appears to be there now. Give us your best take here Michael.
Well, Peter, I don't think we're going to see regime change soon. I think the regime's in a world of hurt over the medium term, though, because they've looked so powerless, out of control and humiliated. You're right, the Supreme Leader's hiding away in a bunker. He's using no electronics to communicate. That means he's on the back foot understanding what is going on. He's also on the back foot in giving any orders and instructions. But the Iranian military has a range of short-range rockets and missiles that can reach to US bases around the region. They're much closer than Israel. And they could do nasty low-tech things in the Straits of Hormuz, like float sea mines there to disable the world's energy supply. There are things they can do.
All right, let's just step back and look at sort of the UN, as impotent as it is, and this discussion that was had. There was a convening of a meeting of the Security Council over the weekend. They can meet even if the Prime Minister can't get out of bed. And there was talk that this was somehow a breach of international law. China pushed this pretty hard. Have a listen.
China strongly condemns the US attacks on Iran and the bombing of nuclear facilities under the safeguards of the IAEA. The actions of the United States seriously violate the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law, as well as Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity.
So that comment there from China, we know obviously they've been supportive to date of Iran. We know that the Iranian Foreign Minister is on his way to Russia. The Russian government condemned the strikes as well, saying they will negotiate with Tehran. International law being breached, where do you see things will go now with China and Russia potentially?
Well, isn't it interesting that the regimes who have a habit of breaking international law repeatedly are the ones that seem to hold it most dearly at this point? So the supporters of Iran, and Putin is dependent on Iran for some of his drone supplies, and Beijing breaking every international law whenever they feel like it, they both now have an attack of principle. This action was to remove an active threat to the region, but also to Israel, and Israel's in direct conflict with Iran. So I think there's a legitimacy there. At the same time, we shouldn't be surprised that the rules-based global order is extremely damaged and probably over.
Just quickly before we go, I mean, I'm really critical that the Prime Minister yesterday admits he wasn't warned. I don't expect Australia would be. But having not been warned, does nothing about finding out what on earth's gone on with his Australia's most significant ally until convening an NSC this morning. Why on earth wouldn't he have had CDF and others in for briefings yesterday? Why would there have been no NSC meeting until today? Mr.
Albanese, through his whole first term, failed to take national security seriously. He's doing the same in the second term. So he's not a national security leader. And in the dangerous world we're in, that's a real indictment. I agree. Not getting briefed is bizarre. There are thousands of Australians living in the region trying to get home. He's just sent hundreds of ADF personnel into a very dangerous, vulnerable situation at that big airbase in Al Minhad. He seems not to grasp the Australian interests at stake here.
Not wrong. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Michael Shoebridge.